In the dream, you are standing on a sidewalk in a vast, gritty city. It looks and smells a lot like inner city Baltimore.
Right.
And you're looking up at this towering brick building, and in your hands, you're holding a soft padded basket. Then you spot it out of the corner of your eye. An egg just whizzing down at you from above.
Oh, man.
Yeah, so you sprint across the concrete, you stretch out the basket, and you manage to catch it just before it shatters. But you don't even have time to exhale, because here comes another one.
And another.
Exactly. Suddenly, they are falling far too fast. You're frantically darting all over the pavement, lunging like an outfielder, but you simply can't catch them all. They start hitting the ground.
Splattering everywhere.
Splattering yellow yolk all over your shoes, ruining your medical scrubs, and you are just completely desperate for it to stop. You look up, realizing there must be a guy up there on the roof, casually tossing these eggs over the ledge, but the sun is in your eyes and you can't see him.
You're just totally blind to the source.
Right. You're just too busy running, failing miserably, drowning in this overwhelming, suffocating sense of total helplessness. And then you wake up in a cold sweat.
It is an incredibly visceral, haunting nightmare. And, it wasn't just a one-off bad dream.
No.
This plagued Dr. Peter Attia relentlessly during his time as a surgical resident at Johns Hopkins Hospital.
I mean, he was under immense pressure.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. He was training to become a high-level cancer surgeon, routinely working grueling 24-hour shifts, starving for sleep, only to be jolted awake by this exact recurring sequence. The imagery is bizarre, but the subconscious translation is actually quite direct.
What did it mean?
Those falling eggs represented his patients, specifically his late-stage pancreatic cancer patients.
Right, because pancreatic cancer isn't the kind of disease that, taps you on the shoulder to let you know it's there. It's notoriously silent.
It is a total ghost. It grows for years, sometimes literally decades, without producing a single noticeable symptom. No pain, no lump you can feel.
That is terrifying.
It really is. By the time a patient turns jaundiced or experiences abdominal pain and finally gets a scan, the disease is almost always in a highly advanced state. At that point, surgery is an option for only a tiny fraction of people, maybe 20%.
Wow, only 20%.
Yeah. And for those few, the surgeons at Hopkins were the absolute last line of defense. They were performing an incredibly invasive, highly dangerous operation called the Whipple procedure.
I've heard of that. It's incredibly complex.
Extremely. It involves removing the head of the pancreas, the first part of the small intestine, the gallbladder, and the bile duct, and then frantically trying to plumb everything back together.
Jesus.
In the context of the dream, performing a Whipple is the direct equivalent of diving onto the concrete to catch that falling egg before it shatters.
And what's wild is that the medical field, and Hopkins in particular, was getting exceptionally good at catching those eggs.
They were.
The immediate survival rate for the Whipple procedure itself improved drastically over the years. But here's the realization that completely fractured his faith in the system and, well, changed the trajectory of his entire career.
It still wasn't enough.
Exactly, because even if you flawlessly executed this brilliant, complex 8-hour surgery, the vast majority of those patients were still going to succumb to the cancer within a few years.
The egg eventually was going to hit the ground.
Right. And that forced a massive paradigm shift in his thinking. Instead of spending all of our collective genius and billions of dollars trying to build a slightly better padded basket to catch falling eggs.
What if we figure out how to get up to the roof and take out the guy throwing them?
Yes. Welcome to The Book Nook, a podcast dedicated to exploring the most impactful and transformative books in self-help, spirituality, psychology, personal growth, and all types of literature.
We are so glad you're here.
Today, we are taking you up to that roof. We are doing a deep dive into what might be the ultimate operating manual for proactive medicine, exploring the concepts laid out in Outlive. The Science and Art of Longevity by Dr. Peter Attia.
It's an incredible book.
It really is. The mission for this deep dive is clear. We are going to explore how you can dramatically alter the trajectory of your own aging. We are not just talking about tacking a few frail years onto the end of your lifespan.
No, we're talking about fundamentally adding life, vitality, and true capability to your years.
So to understand how to achieve that, We first have to dissect why our current medical system, despite possessing the most advanced technology in human history, struggles so profoundly to keep us healthy as we age.
Right, we have to confront the limitations of what Dr. Attia calls medicine 2.0.
I want to spend some time here because the critique of the medical establishment isn't coming from some, fringe outsider.
Not at all.
The author is a product of the absolute apex of this system. Johns Hopkins, Stanford, the National Institutes of Health. He spent years in the belly of the beast.
He really did.
And his early clinical experiences hammered home the dichotomy between two very different types of death. He categorizes them as fast death and slow death.
And that distinction is the key to understanding the entire problem. Fast death is acute, immediate, and violent. It is the trauma that ruled the ERs in inner-city Baltimore.
Gunshot wounds, severe burns, car accidents.
Exactly. But it's also sudden, catastrophic internal failures. For example, during his second year of medical school, he witnessed his first patient death in the ER at Stanford.
I remember reading this part. It was a younger woman, right?
Yeah, a woman in her mid-30s came in complaining of shortness of breath. She was fully conscious, communicating with him 1 minute, and the very next minute she was gasping for air, her eyes rolled back into her head, and she lost consciousness entirely.
I can't even imagine the adrenaline spike in that room. The medical team floods in. They run a code.
Total chaos.
They are snaking an endotracheal tube down her airway to force oxygen into her lungs, pushing epinephrine into her veins to jumpstart the heart, slapping defibrillator paddles on her chest.
And the author, who was just a medical student at the time, is suddenly doing violent chest compressions on a real human being.
And despite all of that incredibly choreographed, heroic effort, she died right there on the table.
Just incredibly tragic. He suspected later it was a massive pulmonary embolism.
Right. For context, that's when a blood clot, usually originating deep in the legs, breaks free, travels through the heart, and forcibly lodges in the pulmonary arteries of the lungs.
It instantly chokes off the blood supply, starving the entire body of oxygen. That is the absolute epitome of fast death. And, we have to give credit where credit is due here.
Yeah, modern medicine is amazing at this.
Medicine 2.0 is nothing short of miraculous when it comes to fighting fast death. If you shatter your femur in a motorcycle crash or contract a severe systemic bacterial infection, Medicine 2.0 is a godsend.
We've revolutionized antibiotics. We can transplant entire organs. We can decompress a crushed spine.
Exactly. We have mastered the art of pulling humans back from the absolute brink of acute destruction.
But, and this is the massive but for everyone listening to this deep dive today, fast death probably isn't what's going to get you.
Unless you are engaging in extreme base jumping or habitually texting while driving.
Right. The odds are heavily stacked against acute trauma. For the vast majority of us, the real threat is slow death. The slow, silent, creeping diseases of aging.
While trauma and chaos dominated the nights in the emergency department, the daylight hours belonged almost entirely to slow death.
The hospital wards.
Yeah, the wards filled with patients suffering from advanced vascular disease, gastrointestinal decay, and widespread cancer. These internal wounds weren't caused by a knife or a bullet.
They were caused by treating a chronic, decades-long disease with a trauma playbook feels like, well, it's like calling the fire department only after the roof of your house has already caved in.
Yes.
Instead of, installing smoke detectors and using fire-retardant building materials 10 years ago, it's waiting for the disaster to peak before reacting. Why is the medical establishment so incredibly resistant to treating the smoldering smoke?
It comes down to the fundamental ethos of medical training, which is pounded into every doctor. First, do no harm, quickly followed by nobody dies on my watch.
Right.
The entire systemic focus, the insurance coding, the standard of care, is built entirely around stepping in to stop imminent catastrophe. But with chronic diseases, the underlying damage begins long before any outward symptoms appear.
By the time a disease is entrenched enough to be officially diagnosed on a chart, it's often far too late to truly reverse the cellular damage.
Exactly. We're intervening at the entirely wrong point on the timeline.
These chronic diseases are categorized as the Four Horsemen of aging. These are the adversaries we're actually fighting. Let's lay them out.
The Four Horsemen responsible for the vast majority of slow death are heart disease or cardiovascular disease, cancer, neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and type 2 diabetes, along with broader metabolic dysfunction.
I want to zoom in on that fourth horseman, type 2 diabetes, because the way our current medical system handles it is just, it's the most maddening, perfect example of everything we are talking about.
It really is.
How does Medicine 2.0 actually diagnose and treat metabolic dysfunction?
Under the strict standard of care guidelines that doctors are required to follow, you are officially diagnosed with type 2 diabetes when a specific blood test your hemoglobin A1C, it's exactly 6.5%.
Let's pause and explain what that actually means biologically rather than just throwing numbers around.
Hmm.
What is hemoglobin A1C?
Hemoglobin is the protein inside your red blood cells that carries oxygen. As glucose, or blood sugar, circulates in your bloodstream, it naturally attaches itself to this hemoglobin in a process called glycation. Because a red blood cell lives for about 120 days, measuring the percentage of hemoglobin that has sugar attached to it gives doctors a highly accurate 3-month average of your blood sugar levels.
So it's not just a snapshot.
Right. An A1C of 6.5% roughly corresponds to an average continuous blood glucose level of about 140 milligrams per deciliter.
Okay, so once you cross that magical 6.5% threshold, what happens?
The medical system unleashes its arsenal. You get extensive treatment plans. You are prescribed drugs like metformin to reduce liver glucose production.
Okay, other stuff too, right?
Yeah, you might get drugs that force your pancreas to secrete more insulin, and eventually they will just start injecting you with exogenous insulin to forcibly shove that toxic excess glucose out of the blood and into your highly resistant muscle and fat tissues.
It is a full-scale intervention.
A massive one.
But wait, here's the part that should make everyone listening furious. If my A1C test comes back at 6.4%, which means my average blood glucose is 137 instead of 140, what happens? I technically don't have the disease, right? What is the urgent medical intervention then?
In the eyes of Medicine 2.0, you just have a condition called prediabetes. And the standard of care is essentially some mildly worded advice to watch what you eat, maybe a suggestion to walk a bit more, and a note in your file for annual monitoring.
Just a note in the file.
Yep. In other words, the prevailing strategy is to wait and see if you actually develop the full-blown systemic disease before treating it as an urgent medical crisis.
That is insane. It's treating a complex, decades-long metabolic spectrum as if it's a binary on-off switch.
Exactly.
It's treating metabolic decay like a broken arm. You either have a broken bone or you don't. But metabolic dysfunction doesn't happen overnight. It is a cumulative, grinding process.
It takes years.
Telling someone with a heavily elevated A1C of 6.4% to just monitor it is the literal equivalent of standing on the sidewalk, watching the egg plummet toward the pavement, and deciding to wait until it is 1 millimeter from the concrete before you lift your basket.
It is a profound failure of prevention. But acknowledging that Medicine 2.0 intervenes far too late forces us to ask a much deeper question.
Which is?
If we do manage to intervene earlier, what exactly are we trying to achieve? What is the actual goal of extending human life? This requires us to separate two concepts that are often conflated: lifespan and health span.
Because true longevity does not just mean notching more and more birthdays on a calendar. Nobody listening to this deep dive wants to live to be 110 years old if the last 3 decades are spent bedridden, unable to recognize their own children, and suffering in constant, agonizing physical pain.
Absolutely not. And to perfectly illustrate the horror of that outcome, there's a powerful story from Greek mythology regarding a mortal named Tithonus.
Oh, I love this part.
Tithonus was a beautiful young man who became the mortal lover of Eos, the divine goddess of the dawn. Eos was so enamored with him that she went to Zeus and begged him to grant Tithonus eternal life so they could be together forever.
And Zeus agreed.
Zeus agreed and granted the wish. But in her desperate excitement, Eos made a tragic, catastrophic error. She asked for eternal life, but she forgot to ask for eternal youth.
Oh, wow. So the aging process didn't stop.
It didn't stop at all. Tithonus lived forever, but his mortal body and mind continued to age, decay, and wither endlessly.
That sounds like torture.
It was. His skin shriveled, his mind faded, his limbs lost their strength. He was eternally trapped in a state of agonizing decrepitude, unable to die, but completely unable to live.
That is a deeply horrifying concept. But what's truly unsettling is that a localized, modern version of that exact myth is playing out in our hospitals and nursing homes every single day.
It really is.
We have utilized the brilliant tools of Medicine 2.0 to artificially extend our chronological lifespan. We can surgically bypass clogged arteries. We can keep the heart pumping with pacemakers. We can keep the lungs inflating with ventilators long after the body's natural systems have failed.
But we have largely failed to extend the quality of those final years. This period of prolonged decay is what Dr. Attia terms the marginal decade.
The marginal decade, what does that actually look like for someone?
It represents the final years of a person's life, And for an unacceptably large portion of society, it is defined almost entirely by suffering.
Yeah.
It is characterized by severe physical frailty, an inability to perform basic daily tasks independently, chronic inflammation and pain, and tragically often severe cognitive decline or Alzheimer's.
Is the modern manifestation of Tithonus.
Exactly. Lingering on in a twilight state of ever-declining health, kept alive by machines and pharmaceuticals.
I know that you listening to this have likely witnessed this firsthand. You have probably watched a parent, a grandparent, or friend's loved one suffer through their marginal decade.
It's incredibly common.
It is deeply traumatizing to watch someone you love lose their agency, to watch their personality slowly fade away behind a fog of cognitive decline. It's a reality that haunts a lot of people.
In fact, when patients first sit down for a consultation in a proactive medicine clinic, they almost always bring this up immediately. They say, I absolutely do not want to live longer if it means ending up frail and helpless like my parents did.
It's the most common fear. But the crucial intervention here is emphasizing that just because your parents endured a painful, debilitating old age or died younger than they should have from heart disease does not mean that you are doomed to follow that exact same script.
The past does not strictly dictate the future. Human longevity, both how long you live and how well you live, is remarkably malleable if you understand the levers to pull.
The entire mission of proactive medicine, or Medicine 3.0, is to take that dreaded marginal decade and forcefully transform it into what is called a bonus decade.
A period of late life where you aren't just surviving on a cocktail of pills, you are thriving.
Right. You are physically capable of traveling, cognitively sharp enough to learn new things, and emotionally present with your family.
But to avoid the tragic fate of Tithonus, we cannot simply rely on hope or good luck or waiting for a pharmaceutical miracle. We need a rigorous, executed plan.
And before we can even begin to discuss the specific daily tactics, the optimal diets, the workout splits, the supplements, we have to establish a foundational strategy.
And this is a lesson that the author himself had to learn the hard way through a deeply personal and, frankly, embarrassing wake-up call.
This story is so revealing because it shatters our assumptions about what healthy looks like. Let's set the scene.
Okay, paint the picture.
It's September 2009. The author is 36 years old. He is standing on a sandy beach on Catalina Island, just off the coast of California. In his mind, he is an absolute, undeniable superhero.
And to be fair, in that specific moment, he kind of is one. He has just completed a 21-mile open ocean swim from the coast of Los Angeles to the island.
A swim that took him 14 grueling, agonizing hours. He was battling cold water, fighting unpredictable ocean currents, pushing his body to the absolute brink of endurance.
It's an insane physical feat.
So he drags himself onto the beach. He is elated. He's celebrating. He's got a well-earned cheeseburger in one hand, maybe a sugary soda in the other. He believes he is the absolute picture of elite athletic achievement. And then his wife, Jill, looks at him and says, very gently, Peter, I think you should work on being a little less not thin.
Less not thin. It's such a brilliant, cutting, wife-approved way of delivering hard news.
I mean, imagine swimming the Pacific Ocean for 14 hours and getting hit with that. He said he nearly dropped his cheeseburger in the sand.
It was a massive blow to his ego, but deep down, looking in the mirror, he knew she was entirely correct.
Yeah.
Despite viewing himself as an elite endurance athlete, and despite exercising with absolute fanatical intensity, his body composition had severely deteriorated.
Yeah.
He had ballooned up to over 210 pounds. He developed a literal dad bod.
But the cosmetic reality of the mirror was nothing compared to the terrifying metabolic reality hiding underneath, right? The real wake-up call was his blood work.
Exactly. Because you can look somewhat normal on the outside, while your internal engine is absolutely tearing itself apart.
What exactly did those labs reveal?
His blood work showed that despite thousands of hours of intense aerobic exercise, he'd become highly insulin resistant.
Okay, let's explain what that means mechanistically. Because insulin resistance gets thrown around on health blogs constantly. What is actually happening to the cells?
Think of insulin as a key. When you eat food, your body breaks it down into glucose, which enters the bloodstream. Your pancreas senses this and releases insulin.
Makes sense.
The insulin travels to your muscle and SAT cells, acts as a key to unlock the door, and allows the glucose to leave the blood and enter the cell to be used for energy.
But when you are insulin resistant,
The locks on those cellular doors have become rusted and blunted. The insulin key no longer works efficiently, so the glucose gets trapped in the bloodstream.
and the pancreas panics.
Yes, Thinking there isn't enough insulin, it pumps out even more. You end up with a condition called hyperinsulinemia, chronically high insulin levels, along with elevated blood sugar. It is the silent, insidious first step down the road to systemic metabolic dysfunction and type 2 diabetes.
And it wasn't just the insulin. His hormonal profile was crashing.
Yeah, his testosterone levels had plummeted to below the 5th percentile for a man of his age. He had the hormone profile of a sick, elderly man.
Wow.
And when you contextualize this with his family history, a family tree densely populated with men who suffered catastrophic fatal heart attacks in their 40s, he realized he was standing on the absolute precipice.
He was flirting with the Four Horsemen. If he didn't drastically change his approach, his life was in imminent danger.
That moment on Catalina Beach shifted everything. He realized that exercising blindly, relying purely on endurance tactics without a comprehensive biological strategy, was completely failing him.
Which leads us to the core structural framework necessary for longevity: objective, strategy, and tactics.
This tripartite framework is vital because almost everyone intuitively approaches health completely backward. They start with tactics.
Just jumping right to what to eat and how to lift.
Right. And to understand why this is a recipe for failure, we need to look at a brilliant historical analogy that outlines the difference between tactics and strategy. The legendary 1974 Rumble in the Jungle boxing match between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman.
Oh, let's set the stage for this, because if you don't know boxing history, you might not grasp how terrifying George Foreman was.
He was a nightmare.
This wasn't the jovial, smiling guy selling countertop grills on late-night TV. In 1974, George Foreman was an absolute monster. He was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. He was younger than Ali, larger, and hit with devastating concussive power.
He had just annihilated Joe Frazier, knocking him down 6 times in 2 rounds. The entire sports world thought Ali was walking into an execution.
So Ali's objective was simple and clear: defeat George Foreman and regain the heavyweight title. But how could he possibly achieve that?
If Ali just walked into the center of the ring and started throwing standard combinations of punches, which are tactics, Foreman would have decapitated him. He couldn't outbrawl him. He needed a superior strategy.
A strategy requires a deep analytical study of the adversary's strengths, weaknesses, and tendencies.
Exactly. Ali studied Foreman meticulously. He recognized that Foreman was hot-headed, prone to blinding anger, and critically, he was entirely unaccustomed to fights lasting very long.
Because he usually knocked his opponents unconscious in the early rounds, he had never really had his endurance tested.
Right. So Ali's overarching strategy wasn't about overpowering Foreman. It was psychological and physiological attrition. The strategy was to induce Foreman to wear his own self out.
Make him angry, let him flail away, let him burn through all of his heavy cellular energy reserves, and then, only once he is deeply fatigued and vulnerable, mount a lethal offensive.
And it was from that overarching strategy that Ali's specific tactics flowed. Those tactics became legendary, but they only made sense within the context of the strategy.
Like leading with the right hand, right?
Yes. Early in the fight, Ali repeatedly threw straight right-hand leads directly at Foreman's face. In boxing, leading with the right hand is technically dangerous and considered highly disrespectful. It was a tactic designed specifically to enrage Foreman and provoke a wild response.
Then came the most famous tactic, the rope-a-dope.
Ali leaned far back against the loose ropes, covered his head with his gloves, and literally allowed the furious, heavy-hitting Foreman to relentlessly pound away at his arms and torso.
For the first few rounds, the commentators, the crowd, and even Foreman himself thought Ali was getting absolutely crushed.
But Ali was absorbing the blows on his arms while the ropes absorbed the impact of his shifting body weight. By the 5th round, the strategy had fully materialized. Foreman was completely gassed.
He had punched himself into exhaustion.
Yep. Ali, who had conserved his energy, had plenty left in the tank. He took control of the fight and ultimately knocked a deeply exhausted Foreman out in the 8th round.
The application here to human longevity is profound. The tactics are the specific actions you take in the arena, the exact ratio of macronutrients you eat, the specific heart rate zone you target on the treadmill, the brand of fish oil you take.
But the strategy is the comprehensive, scientific plan based on the biological reality of your adversary. And our adversaries are the insidious cellular mechanisms of the Four Horsemen.
And this is where it gets incredibly frustrating, because we live in a culture that is utterly obsessed with tactics while being completely blind to strategy.
Oh, the diet wars.
Yes. We spend all day arguing on social media, Is the keto diet morally superior to a vegan diet? Should I be doing CrossFit or Pilates? Should my intermittent fasting window be 16 hours or 18 hours?
We are jumping straight into the ring, throwing wild punches at the air without ever establishing a strategy. But you cannot out-tactic a fundamentally flawed strategy. If you don't understand the cellular mechanisms of insulin resistance or the vascular triggers for heart disease, your dietary tactics are just blind guesswork.
Medicine 3.0 requires us to become master strategists of our own biology. Our objective is to delay mortality and maximize physical and cognitive function in our final decades.
And our strategy is to proactively delay the onset of the Four Horsemen by manipulating our metabolic health. But to build that strategy effectively, we have to study the people who have already successfully beaten the opponent.
We have to look at the ultimate undisputed champions of longevity. Which brings us to the centenarians.
The centenarians. These are individuals who live to be 100 years old or beyond.
Now, the common cynical assumption is, sure, they lived a long time, but they probably spent the last 30 years in a wheelchair drooling in a nursing home. We assume they just stretched out the marginal decade.
But the clinical data absolutely obliterates that assumption. It shows the exact opposite. Centenarians are not merely living longer, they are fundamentally aging at a different biological rate.
They experience what geriatricians call a compression of morbidity.
Right. This means they delay the onset of severe chronic disease by decades compared to the rest of the population, and when they do finally decline, the period of sickness is incredibly short.
Thomas Perls, who directs the New England Centenarian Study, has documented that these individuals are often living independently, managing their own affairs, and remaining physically robust well into their 90s.
And there is a statistic here that genuinely broke my brain. When a healthy centenarian is 80 years old, their internal physiology often resembles that of an average 60-year-old.
Wow.
When they were 60, their coronary arteries look like they belong to a healthy 35-year-old. They are essentially walking through life a full generation younger than their chronological birth certificate claims.
Which forces the obvious scientific question, how are their bodies doing this?
Well, the undeniable truth is that extreme longevity is heavily intertwined with genetics. We have to understand that biological evolution hasn't relentlessly optimized the human body to thrive at age 100.
Right. Natural selection is primarily concerned with ensuring we survive long enough to reproduce and perhaps raise our offspring to independence.
Once we hit our 40s and 50s, evolution essentially clocks out. This is exactly why genetic predispositions to late-onset diseases like Alzheimer's or cancer remain so prevalent in the human gene pool. They simply don't impact our evolutionary fitness during our reproductive years.
But the centenarians clearly possess something different. They seem to have drawn winning tickets in the genetic lottery.
They absolutely have. Studies analyzing massive databases of Scandinavian twins have provided incredible insight here. They suggest that for the average population living up to about age 80, genetics only account for roughly 20 to 30% of the variance in lifespan. Lifestyle is the dominant factor.
But when you look at extreme longevity,
When you look at living past 95 or 100, genetics become the dominant driver. The math is wild. If you have a sister who lives to be 100, you are statistically 8 times more likely to reach that age yourself.
and if you have a brother,
If you have a centenarian brother, you are 17 times as likely.
that implies there are specific, identifiable biological mechanisms at play. What do these genes actually do?
Researchers have identified several specific genetic variants strongly associated with this phenotype. One of the most famous is a variant of the FOXO3 gene. A long-running, exhaustive study of Japanese-American men living in Hawaii discovered a powerful link between this specific FOXO3 variant and extreme longevity.
Let's break that down. I don't want to just say gene and move on.
Yeah.
What is FOXO3 actually doing inside the cell?
FOXO3 produces what is called a transcription factor. You can think of a transcription factor as a master switch or a general contractor inside the nucleus of your cell.
Okay.
When FOXO3 is activated, it travels to the DNA and turns on a whole cascade of other genes. These subordinate genes are responsible for cellular housekeeping. They initiate DNA repair. They regulate the cell's resistance to oxidative stress. They clear out misfolded protein.
It's like a deep clean for the cells.
Exactly. And they may even play a direct role in forcing damaged cells to self-destruct before they can become cancerous. In centenarians, this master switch seems to function far more efficiently, keeping their cellular machinery pristine for decades longer than average.
Okay, I have to stop you here because I am putting myself in the shoes of the listener right now.
Go ahead.
If I look at my family tree and I see absolutely 0 centenarians, If my genetic iceberg suggests that I am heavily destined for cardiovascular disease or cancer at age 65, why should I even care about FOXO3?
It's a fair question.
If I didn't win the genetic lottery, if I don't have the hardware, isn't this entire conversation just an exercise in depressing inevitability?
It is the most vital question asked, and the answer is the most incredibly hopeful part of this entire framework.
Yeah.
Because while your genome, the actual hard-coded sequence of DNA you inherited from your parents, is completely immutable, your epigenome, or your gene expression, is highly malleable.
Epigenetics, the software that runs the hardware.
Precisely. We can utilize specific, targeted behaviors and environments to alter our gene expression, forcing our cells to mimic the centenarian phenotype, even if we lack their specific lucky genotype.
We can essentially hack the software to make the hardware run better.
The author refers to this concept as manufacturing our own longevity alpha. He borrows that term from Wall Street, where alpha describes the excess return on an investment relative to the market average. We are trying to generate biological alpha.
And that FOXO3 gene is the perfect example. Even if you don't carry the lucky centenarian variant, the standard FOXO3 gene you do have can be forcefully activated or suppressed by how you live.
We know clinically that when the body is subjected to slight, manageable stressors, like periods of nutrient deprivation during fasting, or the intense cellular energy demands of rigorous exercise, FOXO3 tends to upregulate.
It turns on the cellular repair mechanisms to deal with the stress. We can deliberately use tactics to force our biology to act more like a centenarian's biology.
Which perfectly sets up the single most powerful tactical intervention we possess to manufacture that longevity alpha.
People constantly ask me for the secret. They want to know which obscure berry from the Amazon rainforest to blend into their smoothie, or which $150 a month supplement powder is going to save them.
And the truth is, the most potent longevity drug ever discovered isn't a pill, and it's practically free. It is exercise.
The author states this unequivocally, and the epidemiological data backs him up completely. Exercise is, by several orders of magnitude, the most potent longevity drug in our arsenal.
The numbers are almost hard to believe. A surprisingly minimal dose of exercise can lengthen your life significantly. Transitioning from being completely sedentary to engaging in just 90 minutes of moderate exercise a week, that's less than 15 minutes a day, can reduce your risk of dying from all causes by 14%.
There is simply no pharmaceutical compound on the face of the earth that can replicate those widespread systemic benefits across both lifespan and health span.
And yet, because we are obsessed with tribal tactics, we overcomplicate it. There is a great story in the book about the author's friend, John Griffin.
Oh, the email story.
Yeah. John sent him a quick text message, basically asking the classic medicine 2.0 tactical question, "Hey, I want to get healthy. Should I be doing more cardio on the treadmill or more weights in the gym? I'm confused by all the contradictory advice online."
He was just looking for a simple binary answer.
Right, and instead of shooting back a quick do-aids bro text, Dr. Attia was deeply provoked by the binary nature of the premise. He sat down at his computer and started typing.
And he just kept typing.
By the time he finally hit send, he'd written a dense 2,000-word memo. That single email eventually expanded into a 10,000-word manifesto, which ultimately served as the foundational seed for this entire book.
Because the answer to the cardio versus weights debate isn't an either-or proposition, it is a resounding both, plus a third element most people ignore completely.
We have to stop viewing exercise through this narrow aesthetic lens of what makes me look best in a swimsuit.
If our objective is to optimize our physical machinery for a century of use, that requires a highly multidimensional approach. The author breaks down the necessary architecture of exercise into three critical pillars.
Let's dive deep into the first one, which is the absolute bedrock of cardiovascular endurance, VO2 max.
VO2 max is arguably the single most important metric of your physical health. Mechanistically, it measures the maximum volume of oxygen your body can physically take in, transport through the blood, and utilize inside your cells during maximum physical exertion.
It's measured in milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute.
Let's explain why oxygen utilization even matters. Why does a cell need oxygen?
It comes down to cellular energy production. Inside your cells, you have mitochondria, which are essentially microscopic power plants. They produce ATP, which is the fundamental energy currency of the human body.
Okay.
When you are just sitting on the couch listening to this, your energy demands are low. Your body might only need to consume 300 milliliters of oxygen a minute, to produce enough ATP to keep your heart beating and your brain functioning.
But the moment you stand up and start sprinting up a steep hill,
Your muscle cells suddenly demand massive amounts of ATP to contract. To produce that ATP efficiently, the mitochondria need a massive influx of oxygen. Your demand might skyrocket to 4,000 or 5,000 milliliters of oxygen a minute.
so the higher your VO2 max, the larger your aerobic engine. The more oxygen you can physically process, the more ATP you can rapidly produce, and the faster and longer you can run up that hill without your muscles failing and flooding with lactic acid.
But this isn't just about winning a local 5K.
Right. Why does this matter for someone who just wants to live a long time?
Because it is an incredibly profound predictor of overall mortality. A massive, landmark 2018 study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association followed over 120,000 people over a decade. They found a shockingly strong inverse correlation between high VO2 max and lower all-cause mortality.
The researchers noted that having a high aerobic fitness level is associated with a greater survival benefit than almost any other variable studied.
Conversely, if your VO2 max is too low, you don't just lose the ability to run a marathon. As you age and that number naturally declines, eventually your VO2 max will drop so low that your body cannot generate enough ATP to simply walk up a single flight of stairs without severe breathlessness.
You literally lose the physical capacity to engage with the physical world.
So VO2 max is the engine. We need a massive, highly efficient engine. But a powerful engine is useless if you drop it into a rusted, fragile frame.
And that brings us to the second pillar of exercise, muscle mass and strength.
Dr. Attia uses a great analogy here. He refers to muscle as our exoskeleton, drawing a comparison to the Terminator. Underneath the skin, you need an armor of muscle to protect your actual skeleton.
Because as we age, we fall victim to a biological process called sarcopenia.
Yes, sarcopenia is the age-related involuntary loss of skeletal muscle mass and strength, and it is devastating for longevity. We often think of muscle purely in terms of aesthetics or athletic performance, but muscle tissue is actually a highly active endocrine and metabolic organ.
This is a huge point. Muscle is a metabolic sink. What does that mean for glucose and insulin resistance?
Remember our discussion about the danger of elevated blood sugar and insulin resistance. Skeletal muscle is the primary disposal site for glucose in the human body.
When you eat a heavy carbohydrate meal, your muscle cells act like a sponge.
Exactly. Using specialized transporters called GLUT4 to absorb that glucose out of the bloodstream and store it as glycogen for future use. If you have a massive amount of muscle mass, you have a massive sponge. You can process glucose efficiently.
But if you suffer from severe sarcopenia and your muscle mass wastes away, that glucose has nowhere to go.
It remains trapped in the bloodstream, driving up insulin levels and accelerating the onset of type 2 diabetes.
So muscle protects our metabolic health, but even more immediately, it protects our physical structure. When elderly individuals lose their muscular exoskeleton, they become frail, they lose their balance, they fall.
And we all know that a broken hip in an 85-year-old is often a tragic death sentence.
It isn't the broken bone itself that kills them.
No, it is the catastrophic cascade of immobility that follows. They get confined to a hospital bed, they lose even more muscle mass rapidly, their lungs become weak, they develop pneumonia, and they enter a rapid terminal decline.
Having a strong, dense muscular exoskeleton is the absolute baseline requirement for surviving the physical insults and accidents of old age.
Which logically leads us into the third and most frequently ignored pillar of exercise, stability.
You can possess a massive VO2 max, and you can have bulging, powerful muscles, but if you do not possess stability, you're essentially bolting a 600 horsepower Ferrari engine onto a cracked, unaligned wooden wagon frame.
It is only a matter of time before the torque completely tears the frame apart. You are going to suffer a catastrophic injury.
The author had a major humbling revelation regarding this. He was physically elite, swimming oceans and lifting heavy weights, yet he was constantly battling nagging injuries. His back hurt, his shoulders were inflamed.
He eventually realized that true stability is not just doing a few planks at the end of a workout to build core strength. Stability is a deeply neurological foundation. And it starts with something as completely fundamental as how we breathe.
That sounds esoteric, but it is pure biomechanics.
Right. Our breathing patterns directly dictate our posture, our rib cage position, and our structural alignment. If you are living in a state of chronic psychological stress, which most of us are, you tend to take shallow, rapid breaths high up into your chest and neck.
This chronically tightens the accessory muscles of the neck, pulls the ribcage out of alignment with the pelvis, and turns off the deep, stabilizing muscles of the abdomen.
True stability begins with retraining proper, deep diaphragmatic breathing, ensuring the rib cage is stacked perfectly over the pelvis, creating a rigid, pressurized cylinder of support for the spine.
And it extends all the way down to the intrinsic muscles of the feet, which dictate how force is transferred from the ground up through the body.
The book details a very specific foundational exercise to test and build this stability, called the step-up box.
And the way he describes executing it is a masterclass in biomechanical intent. You aren't just mindlessly stepping up and down onto a box like it's a 1980s aerobics class.
No, you are standing in front of a low box, maybe 12 to 18 inches high. You place one foot entirely on the box, and before you even move, you inhale, and as you begin to step up, you exhale sharply.
Actively engaging the abdominal obliques and pulling the ribs down over the pelvis to lock that cylinder into place.
The ascent is important, but the downward phase, the eccentric phase, is where the real magic and vulnerability lie. You don't just let gravity pull you back down and crash onto the floor.
You step the non-working foot off the back edge of the box, shift your weight back into the hip of the working leg, and you lower yourself incredibly, agonizingly slowly.
You are fighting gravity every millimeter of the way.
Exactly. You are aiming for a slow, controlled 3 or 4 second descent, heavily loading the glute and the hamstring of the working leg, maintaining complete, unwavering structural control until the toe of your back foot silently touches the ground.
If you find yourself free-falling the last 2 inches, or if your knee violently caves inward, you do not have stability. It means you're using too much weight or the box is too high, and your nervous system cannot control the joint under eccentric load.
It is entirely about retraining your central nervous system to safely manage force. Now, all of these incredibly demanding components, the VO2 max intervals, the heavy resistance training, the meticulous stability work, they aren't being done so you can pose on a bodybuilding stage.
They all serve a very specific, highly personalized objective. To organize all of this, the author introduces an absolutely brilliant conceptual framework called the centenarian decathlon.
I love this concept because it gives purpose to the suffering of exercise.
In track and field, an Olympic decathlete trains relentlessly for 10 specific, highly varied events, sprinting, throwing, jumping, to prove they are the world's most capable all-around athlete.
Dr. Attia argues that each of us needs to design our own centenarian decathlon. We need to explicitly define the 10 physical tasks we want to be absolutely capable of performing independently in our final decade of life.
We aren't training to win gold medals. We're training to win the activities of daily living.
I want you, the listener, to stop and genuinely think about this right now. Picture yourself at age 85. What exactly do you want to be able to do?
Do you want to be able to hike a 2-mile trail with uneven terrain?
Do you want to be able to lift a 30-pound grandchild out of a crib from a bent-over position?
Do you want to be able to carry a 15-pound bag of groceries up a steep flight of stairs?
Do you want to be able to get up off the floor using only one arm for support?
Do you want to be able to clip your own toenails?
That last one, clipping your own toenails, sounds almost comical when you are 30 years old. But think about the biomechanics required.
It requires a tremendous amount of hip mobility, core compression, spinal flexion, and vision. For an 80-year-old with osteoarthritis and a rigid spine, clipping their toenails is a monumental, often impossible physical challenge that requires them to surrender their independence and ask for help.
And here is the brutal, unavoidable math of aging that makes the centenarian decathlon so urgent. If your goal is to be able to lift a 30-pound grandchild at age 85, you have to reverse engineer that goal.
We know biologically that after age 50, you are going to lose a certain percentage of your muscle mass and strength every single decade. No matter what you do, it's the toll of time.
Therefore, to ensure you can lift 30 pounds at 85, you have to build a massive surplus of strength right now when you are 40 or 50.
You might need to be capable of lifting 60 or 70 pounds dynamically today, just to ensure the inevitable decay doesn't drop you below that 30-pound threshold later. You are essentially banking physical capital.
It completely shifts your entire psychological orientation toward the gym. Working out is no longer a superficial chore to look slightly better on a beach vacation. It is a critical, non-negotiable investment in securing your future physical independence.
But as incredibly powerful as exercise is, and it is the most powerful tool we have, you fundamentally cannot out-train a toxic metabolic environment.
You can have a massive engine, but if you are constantly pouring contaminated fuel into the gas tank, the engine is eventually going to seize.
Which brings us to the next vital tactical domain. We have to adapt our biology to a world of absolute caloric abundance. We have to address nutrition.
And the very first piece of advice the author gives regarding nutrition is incredibly refreshing. We need to completely abandon the religious diet wars.
We need to step away from the endless vitriolic internet debates over whether the ketogenic diet is morally superior, or if low fat is the only way, or if we should all become strictly plant-based vegans, or if the carnivore diet is the secret to human evolution.
It is a massive stressful distraction. Instead, we need to shift our analytical focus to what he calls nutritional biochemistry.
Nutritional biochemistry strips away the dogma and focuses entirely on understanding how your specific individual cellular machinery metabolizes different combinations of macronutrients.
It's not about what a guru tells you to eat. It's about what your continuous glucose monitor and your lipid panels tell you is happening inside your blood.
To understand why we are all so metabolically sick, we have to look at our evolutionary context. Homo sapiens are opportunistic omnivores.
Our ancestors survived the brutal crucible of natural selection precisely because they possessed the metabolic flexibility to eat and digest almost anything and everything they could forage or hunt.
And one of the most critical, life-saving metabolic pathways they developed involved the consumption of fructose.
We have to talk deeply about fructose because this is where the evolutionary mismatch between our ancient genes and our modern environment becomes catastrophically glaring.
Hundreds of thousands of years ago, our ancestors only encountered fructose very rarely, primarily in the form of whole fruits that ripen for a brief window at the end of summer, or perhaps a highly guarded honeycomb.
And fructose is metabolically unique compared to glucose. Let's explain why. Because to a layperson, sugar is just sugar, but the liver treats them very differently.
Entirely differently. When you consume glucose, let's say from a potato, it enters the bloodstream and can be utilized by almost every cell in your body for immediate energy.
But fructose can only be processed by the liver.
And the liver processes it through a pathway that bypasses the normal energy regulation enzymes like phosphofructokinase. It essentially force feeds the liver mitochondria. And a large portion of that fructose is rapidly converted directly into fat through a process called de novo lipogenesis.
Furthermore, consuming fructose does not trigger the release of leptin, which is the hormone that signals to your brain that you are full and should stop eating.
Which in an ancient hunter-gatherer environment was an absolute superpower.
Think about it. If you stumble upon a bush bursting with ripe berries in late August, your body wants you to gorge on them. It doesn't want you to feel full.
You want you to eat until you were sick, convert all that massive fructose energy directly into fat, and store it on your body. Because that stored fat is the only thing that is going to keep you alive through the barren, freezing, foodless winter that is rapidly approaching.
Fructose was our friend. It was the biological mechanism that allowed humanity to survive winter.
But look around at the environment we live in today. The winter never comes. Food is never scarce. And we are absolutely drowning in a sea of highly refined fructose.
Specifically, liquid fructose in the form of high fructose corn syrup pumped into sodas, juices, and heavily processed foods.
When you drink a 32-ounce soda, you are hitting your liver with a concentrated tsunami of liquid fructose, completely devoid of the fiber that would normally slow its absorption in a whole piece of fruit.
Our ancient genetic programming, which is still violently screaming at us to store fat for an impending famine that never arrives, has absolutely no evolutionary defense against a big gulp.
We are overloading our metabolic systems with massive doses of a macronutrient we were only designed to encounter rarely and seasonally.
This mismatch is the core crux of the modern crisis of abundance. Our food environment has mutated drastically in just the last century, but our underlying genome has scarcely changed in 50,000 years.
The chronic, severe metabolic derangement this liquid fructose causes is a primary, undeniable driver of insulin resistance, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and type 2 diabetes,
which in turn act as massive metabolic accelerants for heart disease, cancer, and Alzheimer's.
So to combat this toxic environment, we have to become highly strategic about our intake. And while the book deliberately avoids prescribing a universal, rigid, eat exactly this, not that diet plan, it does highlight one specific macronutrient that demands far more strategic attention than most people realize.
Protein.
Yes, while the diet world engages in blood feuds over the ratio of carbohydrates versus fats, dietary protein is quietly essential. and arguably the most important macronutrient to optimize as we age.
We just spent a significant amount of time discussing the absolute necessity of building and maintaining a muscular exoskeleton to survive the marginal decade. Well, you physically cannot synthesize new muscle tissue or even maintain existing muscle without providing your body with the adequate raw materials.
And those raw materials are amino acids derived from dietary protein, specifically the amino acid leucine, which is a key trigger for the mTOR pathway that initiates muscle protein synthesis.
Exactly. And what's challenging is that as we age, our bodies become significantly less efficient at processing protein and stimulating that synthetic response.
An older adult often requires a higher bolus of protein per meal just to trigger the same muscle-building response that a 20-year-old gets from a smaller amount.
This often means aiming for protein intakes that are significantly higher than the basic minimum recommended daily allowances set by government guidelines, which are largely designed merely to prevent severe deficiency, not to optimize longevity.
But the timing and the sheer volume of our food intake also matter profoundly. There's a deeply compelling piece of scientific literature regarding how the constant influx of calories affects longevity, highlighted by a landmark 2009 study published in the journal Science.
This is one of the most famous longevity studies ever conducted. It was a long-running, decades-long observation of rhesus monkeys, whose biology closely mirrors our own.
The researchers divided the monkeys into two distinct groups. One group was placed on an ad libitum diet, meaning they were allowed to eat freely, consuming as much food as they wanted, whenever they wanted.
And the other group?
The other group was placed on a strict, calorie-restricted diet, receiving roughly 30% fewer calories, though still nutritionally complete.
The physiological results were stark and undeniable. The monkeys living in a state of continuous dietary abundance aged rapidly, developing diabetes, cancer, and cardiovascular disease at high rates.
The monkeys on the calorie-restricted diet lived markedly longer, their coats looked healthier, they had far less disease, and they maintained a much more youthful biological profile.
It reinforced a fundamental universal biological principle that is seen across species, from yeast to mice to primates. Constant, unmitigated nutritional abundance accelerates the cellular aging process.
It keeps pathways like mTOR constantly switched on in a state of continuous growth and proliferation.
Conversely, applying a slight manageable stressor, like a period of fasting or sustained caloric restriction, forces the body to downregulate those growth pathways and instead activate survival and repair pathways like AMP kinase and our friend the FOXXO3 gene.
A degree of physiological scarcity appears to be essential for longevity.
And this concept of allowing the body time to repair and clear out damage ties intimately into our next incredibly unsung tactical pillar, sleep.
For a very long time, particularly in the hyper-competitive hustle culture of high-end medicine and Silicon Valley startups, sleep was viewed with disdain.
It was seen as a luxury for the weak or an annoying biological obstacle to productivity. "I'll sleep when I'm dead" was the rallying cry of the elite.
And Dr. Attia openly admits he was one of the worst offenders. He was the poster child for this toxic mentality. He would regularly power through 24-hour surgical shifts, prioritize his grueling endurance workouts over rest, and view sleep as a complete waste of valuable time.
But his perspective was violently altered by a wake-up call from a close friend of his, Crook Parsley, who was a former Navy SEAL and a physician serving the SEAL teams.
The SEALs are the ultimate test case for human endurance, and even they realized that sleep deprivation was destroying their operators.
What did Parsley explain to him about the physiology of sleep?
Parsley laid out the profound, undeniable metabolic damage caused by chronic sleep deprivation. When we fail to get sufficient high-quality sleep, our body interprets that as a state of grave evolutionary danger.
We are stuck in a sympathetic nervous system overdrive, the fight-or-flight response.
Cortisol, the primary stress hormone, remains chronically elevated. And critically, our metabolic health falls off a cliff. Clinical studies have shown that just a few consecutive nights of restricted sleep can render an otherwise perfectly healthy, fit individual temporarily insulin-resistant, with blood sugar profiles mimicking a pre-diabetic state.
On top of the metabolic damage, sleep is the primary window for neurological housekeeping. During deep sleep, the brain utilizes something called the glymphatic system, which essentially flushes cerebrospinal fluid through the brain tissue to wash away metabolic waste products, including amyloid beta plaques, which are heavily implicated in the development of Alzheimer's disease.
If you shortchange your sleep, you are allowing that toxic garbage to accumulate in your brain night after night.
The author was forced to realize that all of his fanatical time in the gym, his His meticulous tracking of macronutrients and his obsessive blood testing were being almost completely undermined by his arrogance regarding sleep.
He states it very clearly in the book. Sacrificing sleep in the name of productivity is a highly dangerous, ultimately self-defeating illusion. It destroys your metabolic flexibility, severely compromises your cognitive function, and rolls out the red carpet for the Four Horsemen.
So if we pause here and synthesize everything we've covered, we have mapped out the objective, we understand the strategy, and we have explored the physical tactics.
We know we need to rigorously train for our personalized centenarian decathlon by building our VO2 max and our muscular exoskeleton.
We know we need to master our nutritional biochemistry to avoid the traps of fructose and constant abundance.
And we know we must fiercely prioritize our sleep to allow our biology to repair itself.
If we execute all of this flawlessly, we will have successfully optimized the physical machine.
But here's where the narrative of the book and the story of the author's life takes a very sharp, unexpected, and deeply vulnerable turn.
Because Dr. Attia actually achieved all of this. He successfully executed the entire plan.
He reverses insulin resistance, he built massive physical strength, he optimized his sleep architecture, and he became the absolute pinnacle of human physical health. He had manufactured tremendous longevity alpha.
And yet, despite all of this physical perfection, he found himself in a state of profound emotional despair. He still wanted to die.
Which brings us to the final, and in many ways the most vital, revelation in this entire text. We have to talk about emotional health.
The author dedicates the entire final section of his book to this topic, and he approaches it with raw humility. He admits up front that in this domain, he is not the expert physician dispensing advice. He is the deeply flawed patient desperately trying to heal.
Because the stark reality is this. Extending your physical lifespan is utterly, completely meaningless if your emotional life is a toxic wasteland.
Let's discuss the crisis of 2017 because it perfectly illustrates the paradox. He was physically elite, capable of incredible athletic feats, but emotionally he was completely bankrupt.
He was chronically angry, entirely detached from his family, and driven by a toxic, relentless obsessiveness. The breaking point arrived when he was scheduled to check into an intensive emotional rehabilitation facility in Kentucky.
A step strongly urged by his close friend and therapist, psychiatrist Paul Conti.
The story of his intake interview is incredibly jarring. He is doing a preliminary telephone interview with a female intake worker from the facility. She is just doing her job, asking standard, slightly tedious bureaucratic questions.
And he is so tightly wound, so deeply saturated in unresolved anger that his patience simply snaps. He explodes, screaming, "Fuck you," at the intake worker and slams the phone down.
It is a devastatingly stark contrast. Here is a man dedicating every waking hour of his professional life to discovering how to help human beings live longer, healthier lives. And he is exploding with uncontrollable rage at a stranger who is actively trying to help him save his own mind.
That entire Thanksgiving weekend of 2017 was the absolute nadir. He and his family didn't travel, they didn't see friends, they just remained isolated in their home in a state of tense misery.
And finally, his wife, Jill, who had supported him through everything, delivered a quiet, devastating ultimatum. She looked at this physically perfect, brilliant doctor and told him point blank, "You're of no help to me. In fact, you're hurting me and your kids very badly."
Confronted with the undeniable reality that his emotional toxicity was actively destroying the very family he claimed to be living for, he finally surrendered and went to the facility.
And it was through the grueling process of intense therapy, particularly his ongoing, deeply analytical work with Paul Conti, that he began to unpack the deep subconscious roots of his behavior.
What did they discover? Because his addiction wasn't to drugs or alcohol. It was an addiction to perfection and control.
Paul Conti utilizes a framework that explains how destructive behaviors and rigid obsessions are rarely isolated character flaws. They are most often adaptations.
They're outgrowths of past trauma.
The explosive anger, the emotional detachment from his wife, the need to relentlessly achieve and conquer physical challenges, these were all deeply ingrained, trauma-induced coping mechanisms. They were heavy armor forged in childhood to protect him from deep-seated feelings of inadequacy and insecurity.
And the most profound insight, the one that ties this entire deep dive together, was how this underlying trauma perfectly mapped onto his fanatical obsession with longevity.
During his time in recovery, a fellow patient observed him, listened to him talk about his relentless optimization, and asked him a simple, piercing question. Why would you want to live longer if you're so unhappy?
It is the question that shatters the entire illusion of Medicine 3.0 if it lacks a philosophical foundation.
He was forced to realize that his entire exhaustive pursuit of longevity, the endless tracking of blood biomarkers, the grueling workouts, the meticulous optimization of sleep, wasn't actually driven by a joyful, vibrant pursuit of life.
It was a frantic, fear-driven flight from death.
He was running away from dying, convinced that if he could just control every biological variable, he could outrun his deep internal pain. He was not running toward living.
That realization forced a monumental shift in his entire perspective. Therapy wasn't just about managing anger, it was about fundamentally rewiring how he experienced existence.
He had to learn to shift his daily focus from the relentless, exhausting act of doing to the much more vulnerable act of simply being. From obsessively trying to manipulate and control an uncertain future to actually grounding himself and existing in the present moment with his children.
And he also realized that emotional suffering is not just a psychological burden that makes your days unpleasant. It is a highly destructive physiological state that actively decimates your physical health.
The chronic, unyielding stress of anger and isolation keeps the sympathetic nervous system permanently engaged. It bathes the body in cortisol, drives up systemic inflammation, spikes blood pressure, and degrades the immune system.
Emotional toxicity creates a physiological cascade that will rot the biological engine just as surely, and sometimes more rapidly, than severe cardiovascular disease or a lifetime of smoking.
There's a story he shares near the end of the book that beautifully and hauntingly encapsulates this crucial shift in perspective. It involves his close friend, Rick Elias.
Rick is known to the world as one of the surviving passengers on U.S. Airways Flight 1549, the famous miracle on the Hudson flight where Captain Sullenberger miraculously landed a crippled Airbus A320 on the freezing waters of the Hudson River in 2009.
When you survive a traumatic event of that magnitude, where you literally stare your own imminent, unavoidable death in the face as the water rushes up toward the windows, and then you somehow walk away unharmed, it alters your psychological DNA permanently.
Rick told Dr. Attia that before the plane crash, he had essentially been living his life constantly looking backward in the rearview mirror.
He realized that his previous obsession with time and longevity had been entirely misplaced. He had spent his life mourning past mistakes, harboring old resentments, and remaining trapped by historical pain, constantly telling himself he would eventually get around to enjoying the future once everything was perfect.
But as the plane was going down, he realized the future is never guaranteed.
The plane crash forcefully deleted the past and the future, leaving only the immediate present. It is the ultimate clarifying moment that every single listener needs to confront right now without needing to be in a falling airplane.
You have to ask yourself the hardest question. Why exactly do you want to live longer? What is the purpose of those extra decades? Who are you trying to spend them with?
If your blood pressure is perfect, and your VO2 max is elite, and your resume is flawless, but your children resent you, and your spouse feels utterly alone in your presence, then extending your lifespan is not a victory.
Your longevity becomes a curse. The author finally realized that he didn't just want to live to be 100 to win a biological game. He wanted to live longer so he could actually be a present, loving father, a supportive husband, and a genuinely good person.
That emotional why is the only thing that gives the grueling physical how its meaning.
If we pull all of these threads together, the ultimate lasting value of this deep dive is empowerment. For decades, the paradigm of Medicine 2.0 has implicitly taught us to be passive participants in our own health.
It instructs us to wait until the symptoms arrive, wait for the A1C to hit exactly 6.5, wait for the tumor to grow large enough to be seen on a scan, and then, if we are lucky, a brilliant surgeon can dive onto the pavement and catch the falling egg.
But the framework laid out in this book gives you the tools, the science, and the permission to climb up the stairs, get onto the roof, and take control of the situation.
This philosophy is for anyone who completely refuses to accept the misery of the marginal decade as a foregone conclusion.
Whether you are 30 years old and just now realizing that you need to start heavily investing in your muscular exoskeleton, or you are 65 years old, struggling with insulin resistance and wanting to aggressively reverse your trajectory to reclaim your stability.
Biology is incredibly forgiving if you apply the right stressors. It is never too late to begin manufacturing your own longevity alpha.
As a global society, we spend trillions of dollars and dedicate our brightest scientific minds to inventing incredible machines and complex pharmaceuticals designed solely to keep people from dying. We are obsessed with delaying the absolute final moment of biological failure.
But simultaneously, we spend almost nothing teaching people how to actually live deeply, fully, and presently in the decades leading up to that moment.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to carry with you today. We began by talking about the tragic myth of Tithonus, the mortal man who was granted eternal life without eternal youth, doomed to endless physical decay.
But I want you to imagine a slightly different, perhaps more insidious scenario.
What if, tomorrow morning, you were magically granted the eternal life of Tithonus, and you were guaranteed perfect, unwavering physical health forever? But the catch was that you had to live the rest of eternity carrying the exact same emotional baggage, the exact same unresolved resentments, and the exact same chronic stress that you are carrying right now today.
Would that endless, physically perfect life be a blessing, or would it simply be a beautifully decorated eternal prison?
Your longevity alpha, your ultimate defense against the falling eggs, does not begin on the treadmill or at the bottom of a pill bottle. It starts in your mind.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Make sure to subscribe to the Book Nook so you never miss an episode as we continue to explore the books that change our lives. And we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us which book you'd like us to explore next. We read every single one.